In the summer of 2017, a retired surveyor named Dale Pruitt was mapping a stretch of the Mississippi River near the town of Grafton, Illinois, using a drone equipped with LiDAR, the kind of laser-based imaging technology that archaeologists have used to find hidden cities beneath jungle canopies in Cambodia and Guatemala. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. He was updating floodplain data for a regional engineering firm. But when he reviewed the LiDAR returns that evening, something stopped him. In the middle of the river, where nautical charts showed nothing but water and seasonal sandbars, the imaging revealed a landmass, a real one, with elevation changes and structural features that suggested it had been above water for a very long time, possibly centuries. It was hidden under about 4 feet of river water and a thick mat of river grass and floating debris. It was not on any map, and it was approximately the size of 3 football fields. Pruitt contacted a professor at Washington University in St. Louis. The professor contacted the Army Corps of Engineers, and within 18 months, a team of archaeologists, geologists, and anthropologists had completed the first systematic survey of what they were now calling Site 17G, a submerged island that appears to have been inhabited, used, or visited repeatedly over at least 1,000 years of pre-Columbian history. What they found on it, preserved beneath the waterlogged sediment, was 20 objects. 20 objects that are quietly, methodically, and uncomfortably rewriting what we thought we knew about the ancient history of North America. Some of what you're about to hear has been presented at academic conferences and then not published. Some of it has been published in journals that most people will never read. And one of these objects has been the subject of an internal dispute so significant that 2 members of the original research team resigned rather than sign the final report. Subscribe right now if you haven't already, because you need to be here for all 20 of these, and the one that caused the resignations is not the one you'd expect. Number 20 was the first object the divers pulled from the sediment, and for a few hours everyone on the team thought it was going to be the most interesting thing they found. It was a ceramic vessel, intact, sealed, its opening covered by a fitted disc of fired clay pressed into place, while both pieces were still soft and then allowed to harden together. The vessel stood about 14 inches tall and had been shaped with a technique called paddle and anvil, where the walls are formed by striking the outer surface with a textured paddle while supporting the inner wall with a smooth stone. The texture left by the paddle on the exterior of this vessel was not random. The paddle had been carved with a repeating geometric pattern, a series of interlocking diamonds that appears in the ceramic traditions of multiple cultures across the continent, from the Caddoan peoples of the Arkansas River Valley to the late woodland period communities of the Great Lakes. When the sealed vessel was opened under laboratory conditions, it contained a thick, dark, resinous substance that had hardened over the centuries into something close to the consistency of asphalt. Analysis identified it as a mixture of pine pitch, bear fat, and a third organic compound that took 3 months to identify. The third compound was tobacco, not dried leaf tobacco, but a concentrated extract, reduced down to a paste and mixed into the resin. The vessel appears to have been a sealed container of a ceremonial substance, prepared with great care and preserved with extraordinary intentionality. But it was just number 20. There were 19 more things buried in that island. Number 19 was a copper axe head, and copper, in the context of pre-Columbian North America, almost always means one thing. The Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan, jutting out into Lake Superior, contains one of the largest deposits of pure native copper on Earth. Copper that occurs in a metallic state rather than bound in ore, which means it can be cold worked into tools and objects without smelting. The peoples of the Great Lakes were working this copper into blades, beads, and ornaments more than 5,000 years ago, making the old copper complex one of the oldest metalworking traditions in the world. The axe head from the island matches the copper isotope profile of the Keweenaw deposits precisely. But its shape is unusual. The standard old copper axe has a specific, well-documented form. This one has a slightly different geometry at the pole, the back end of the head, a detail that specialists in Mississippian material culture recognized as characteristic of later period production, closer to 1200 CE than to the earlier archaic tradition. Someone brought Lake Superior copper down to an island in the Mississippi River around 800 years ago, worked it into a specific shape, and left it. The axe shows no signs of use wear. It was never swung at anything. Whatever it was for, it wasn't logging. Number 18 was a set of 7 carved antler pins, each roughly 6 inches long, tapered at both ends, and incised along their length with fine parallel lines. The antler was white-tailed deer, native to the region, so there was nothing unusual about the material. The unusual part was what was attached to the top of 3 of the 7 pins, small carved figures, each about an inch tall, depicting a bird in flight with its wings spread. The bird was not identifiable as any species native to the Mississippi Valley. The proportions, the shape of the beak, and the posture of the wings led the ornithologist consulted by the team to a tentative identification that took everyone aback. The bird depicted, if the identification is correct, is a frigate bird, a large tropical seabird common along the coasts of the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, known for its enormous wingspan and its habit of soaring at high altitude for days at a time without landing. Frigate birds do occasionally appear in the interior of the continent during storms, but they are not a creature anyone living on the Mississippi River would encounter regularly. They are, however, a bird of deep significance in several Mesoamerican traditions, associated with the sky, with long journeys, and with messengers between worlds. Whether the carver on that island had seen a frigate bird personally or had inherited its image through a long chain of cultural transmission is a question that may never be answered. Number 17 was a stone pipe, and pipes in the pre-Columbian Midwest are never just pipes. The Hopewell tradition, which flourished across the Ohio and Illinois River valleys roughly 2,000 years ago, produced some of the most elaborate effigy pipes ever made anywhere in the world, and their presence at a site can tell you a great deal about the social and ceremonial connections of the people who left them. This pipe was not Hopewell in style. It was a straight tubular pipe, about 9 inches long, carved from a single piece of catlinite, the red pipestone quarried from sacred deposits in what is now Minnesota. The carving at the bowl end was minimal but precise, a single human face in low relief, rendered with the serene, almost abstract quality that characterizes the finest work of the upper Mississippian tradition. But it was the interior of the pipe that drew attention. Running through the bore was a thin rod of a different material entirely, a plug of something that had been inserted when the pipe was made, and then sealed in place by being baked into the stone. That material turned out to be a crystallized organic compound, a plant alkaloid, that the biochemists on the team have not yet publicly identified, but have described in internal documents as consistent with a powerful psychoactive substance not native to the upper Midwest. The pipe had been made around the substance rather than the other way around. It was not a pipe that had been used. It was a pipe that had been constructed to contain something specific. Number 16 was where the team's conservator, a 20-year veteran of archaeological fieldwork who had worked at sites in Egypt, Jordan, and Peru, said she felt genuinely unsettled for the first time in her career. It was a human skull, a single one, placed in a shallow basin that had been carved into a large, flat piece of sandstone. The skull had been modified after death. The surfaces of the bone had been carefully scraped and polished to a dull sheen. The eye sockets had been filled with a dark reddish paste that turned out to be a mixture of powdered hematite and animal fat. And across the forehead, incised with a fine tool into the bone itself, was a line of symbols. 11 symbols in a row, evenly spaced, each one roughly a centimeter tall. The symbols do not match any known North American rock art tradition. 3 of them have been identified as structural near matches to symbols in the Olmec system of proto-writing, the oldest writing tradition in the Americas, centered in the lowlands of what is now southern Mexico, and dating back to at least 900 BCE. The skull itself has been radiocarbon dated to approximately 1150 CE, which means someone on this island was using, or had inherited, a symbolic vocabulary with roots stretching back 2,000 years and 1,500 miles to the south. Subscribe right now if this is your first time watching, because you are 11 objects away from the one that made 2 professional archaeologists resign, and you do not want to miss it. Number 15 was a bundle of wooden sticks, 15 of them, each about a foot long, bundled together and lashed with a fine cordage made from twisted plant fiber. At first pass, the team cataloged it as firewood or structural material. On second look, they noticed that the sticks were not random. Every one of them had been cut to the same length with precision, and every one of them had a series of notches cut into one end, different numbers of notches on each stick, arranged in a consistent pattern. The botanist on the team identified the wood as cedar, and the archaeologist recognized the form. These are counting sticks, a form of mnemonic record-keeping used by numerous indigenous cultures across the continent. But the specific notch system on these sticks, the intervals and groupings, matches most closely with a counting tradition documented among peoples of the Gulf Coast and the lower Mississippi Valley, not with the cultures typically associated with the Central River area where the island was found. The bundle had been tied deliberately, kept together as a unit, and then buried in a way that protected it from moisture by surrounding it with dry clay. Someone went to considerable effort to preserve a record that they may have expected someone else to be able to read. Number 14 was a lump of raw material that initially looked like a piece of natural rock until the team's geologist ran it through an X-ray fluorescence analyzer. The material was galena, lead sulfide, a heavy silver-gray mineral that occurs in large deposits in the Missouri and Illinois sections of the Mississippi Valley. Galena was mined extensively by pre-Columbian peoples for use as a white or silvery pigment and as a material for small ornaments and grave goods. None of that was unusual. What was unusual was what was inside the galena. The XRF analysis detected a secondary inclusion, a pocket of a different material embedded within the lead ore. When the lump was carefully sectioned, that pocket turned out to contain a small object, a carved bead roughly a centimeter in diameter, made not from galena or any locally available stone, but from jadeite. True jadeite, as distinct from nephrite or other jade-like minerals, has only one major source in the Americas, the Motagua Valley in Guatemala, the same source that supplied the Olmec and Maya cultures with their most sacred jade. A bead of Guatemalan jadeite, encased inside a lump of Mississippi Valley galena, buried on an island in the river. The encasement appears to have been deliberate, as if someone had embedded the bead in the lead ore intentionally, either to protect it, to conceal it, or to permanently bind two materials from two worlds together. Number 13 was a length of woven textile, about 18 inches square, folded carefully and protected by being wrapped in multiple layers of tanned animal hide. The textile itself had survived in fragmentary condition, but enough remained to allow analysis. The fiber was plant-based and has been identified as cotton. This is significant because cotton is not native to the Mississippi Valley. The only cotton-growing cultures in pre-Columbian North America were in the American Southwest and in Mesoamerica. Finding a cotton textile on an island in the central Mississippi River is, on its own, extraordinary. But the weave structure added another layer. The textile had been woven using a specific interlocking warp and weft pattern that archaeologists recognize from the textile traditions of the Huastec culture, a people who lived along the Gulf Coast of Mexico, and whose weaving techniques are distinctive enough to be identifiable. Someone had carried a piece of Huastec cotton fabric nearly 2,000 miles up the river, and the trade networks that fed into it, and then buried it carefully on an island, wrapped to protect it, as if expecting it to be retrieved. What drops a comment below right now and tell me, do you think this island was a trading post, a ceremonial site, or something else entirely? Because the next 7 objects are going to make you think very differently about what was happening here. Number 12 was a flint blade, but not the kind of flint you find in Illinois. The material is Alabates flint, a distinctive banded red, white, and gray chert that comes from a single source. The Alabates flint quarries in what is now the Texas Panhandle, more than 1,000 miles to the southwest. Alabates flint was quarried and traded across the Great Plains for thousands of years, and its presence at sites far from its source is a reliable marker of long-distance trade networks. But this blade was not typical trade route material. At 11 inches long, it falls into the category of ceremonial or prestige objects, something made to be seen and admired rather than used. The pressure flaking along its edges is among the finest work the team's lithics specialist had ever examined, the kind of craftsmanship that represents hundreds of hours of practice condensed into a single object. The blade had been placed edge down in the sediment, in a way that shielded both cutting edges from damage, and its base had been deliberately broken off, a practice documented at several Mississippian ceremonial sites as a way of ritually killing an object, releasing its power, or neutralizing it before deposition. Someone brought a masterwork of Texas flint knapping more than 1,000 miles, broke it intentionally, and buried it on this island. Number 11 was a fragment of worked bone, about 4 inches long, from an animal that took the team's zooarchaeologist several weeks to identify. The bone had been shaped into a flat spatula-like form and incised along both faces with a series of fine hatched lines arranged in chevron patterns. The bone itself was dense, heavy, and ivory white, unlike the lighter bones of deer or bison. When the identification finally came back, it surprised everyone. The bone was from a manatee, a Florida manatee, a large aquatic mammal native to coastal and estuarine environments along the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic coast of Florida. Manatee bones have been found at pre-Columbian sites in Florida and along the Gulf Coast. Finding one on an island in the central Mississippi River is unusual, but not impossible, since manatees do occasionally enter the river during warm months. But finding one that has been worked into a ceremonial object, incised with geometric patterns, and buried alongside objects from Texas, Guatemala, and Gulf Coast Mexico, suggests that this bone was not picked up locally. It was curated, carried, and deposited as part of a collection that was deliberately assembled from the far corners of a continental world. Number 10 was a ceramic figure, about 7 inches tall, depicting a human in elaborate ceremonial dress. The craftsmanship was exceptional, the kind of controlled, detailed work that takes years to develop. The figure wore a headdress that swept back from the forehead in a series of horizontal tiers, and the face was painted, or had been painted, in a two-color pattern of which traces remained in the recesses of the modeling. The face itself was the first thing anyone on the team noticed, and the last thing they were able to explain. It was not the face of a person from any physical type associated with the indigenous populations of North America. The nose was broad but strongly hooked. The eyes were rendered with heavy lids and a specific epicanthal fold geometry. The lips were full and slightly parted. The chin was strong and projected forward from the lower face in a way that has no parallel in the ceramic anthropomorphic figures of the Mississippian, Hopewell, or Woodland traditions. One member of the team, a physical anthropologist, suggested the face was consistent with phenotypical characteristics more commonly seen in populations of East or Southeast Asian origin. That suggestion was met with significant pushback. The debate is ongoing. The figure sits in storage. Nobody has published a final word on it. Number 9 was a pair of sandals, which sounds impossibly mundane until you think about what it means for something like sandals to survive in a riverine sediment environment for several centuries. They survived because they had been placed inside a ceramic pot before burial, and the pot had been sealed. The sandals were made from a braided plant fiber, and the botanist's analysis identified that fiber as yucca, a plant that does not grow in the Mississippi Valley. Yucca sandals are the footwear most closely associated in the archaeological record with the peoples of the American Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans of the Colorado Plateau, and their neighbors. The sandals were small, suggesting a foot no larger than a modern women's size 6. They showed wear, the kind of wear that comes from actual use, from miles of walking on hard ground. Whoever wore these sandals had walked a very long distance from the nearest yucca plant, and at the end of that journey, or at some point along it, their sandals ended up in a sealed pot on an island in the Mississippi River, carefully preserved as if they mattered deeply to someone. Subscribe right now if you're not already, because the next 5 objects escalate everything, and I promise you the one that caused the resignations is worth waiting for. Number 8 was a set of astronomical records, or what the team's archaeoastronomer identified as astronomical records, inscribed on a series of flat stone tiles, 7 of them, each about 4 inches square. The inscriptions used a dot and bar notation that is formally associated with Mesoamerican calendrical systems, in which a dot represents 1 unit and a bar represents 5, allowing numbers up to 19 to be written before rolling over to the next positional value. The Mesoamerican calendar system using this notation is one of the most sophisticated pre-industrial timekeeping systems ever developed, and its presence this far north, incised on portable stone tiles, is not something the academic literature had prepared anyone for. The archaeoastronomer worked with the tiles for 3 weeks and concluded that the inscriptions recorded a series of Venus cycle observations, tracking the planet's appearance as morning star and evening star across a span of roughly 8 years, which is the interval after which Venus returns to approximately the same position in the sky. Venus tracking in this specific notational system is a hallmark of Mesoamerican astronomical practice. Finding it on an island in Illinois is the kind of discovery that either rewrites the map of pre-Columbian contact or gets very quietly set aside. Number 7 was a mask, and it is the object that has generated more disagreement than any other from Site 17G, with the sole exception of number 1. The mask was carved from a single piece of wood, a dense tropical hardwood that the dendrochronologist identified as mahogany, a species native to Central America and the Caribbean, and not found growing anywhere in North America north of Mexico. The mask was about 9 inches tall and 7 wide, carved in high relief with deeply recessed eye sockets, pronounced cheekbones, and a mouth open in what could be read as a scream or as song. The surface had been painted, and traces of 3 colors remained: blue, red, and black, applied in a pattern that the art historian on the team spent considerable time analyzing. Her conclusion, stated with full awareness of how it would be received, was that the iconographic program of the mask, the specific arrangement of color, the treatment of the face, and 2 small symbols carved above each eyebrow, were most closely paralleled by masks associated with the worship of Tlaloc, the Mesoamerican rain deity, in the traditions of pre-Aztec central Mexico. A mahogany mask, painted in Tlaloc's colors, on an island in the Mississippi River, 800 years ago. Drop a comment right now and tell me what you think is going on here, because I have my own theory, and I want to know if yours matches mine. Number 6 was a clay tablet covered in text. I want to say that again so it lands properly. A clay tablet covered in text, in a writing system that is not the Mesoamerican dot and bar numerals from the astronomical tiles, and not the skull symbols from Object 16, but a third, different, organized system of written communication, inscribed on fired clay in neat rows with consistent spacing, 32 rows on the front face and 28 on the back. The tablet is about the size of a standard index card, and it was wrapped in the same kind of fine cordage encountered with the wooden counting sticks. The writing has been examined by specialists in ancient writing systems from 5 different universities, and none of them have been able to identify it as a known script. What they have agreed on, and this is the part that matters, is that it demonstrates all the structural properties of a genuine writing system: consistent symbol forms, positional variation consistent with a phonemic or logographic system, evidence of function words or grammatical markers as distinct from content symbols, and a symbol inventory of between 60 and 80 distinct forms, which falls within the range typical of syllabic writing systems. Whoever wrote this could write. They had a writing system, and nobody knows what language it encoded or who they were. Number 5 was the point at which the team's lead archaeologist, a 23-year veteran named Dr. Patricia Weller, began to understand that they were dealing with something she had no framework for. Object 5 was a small bronze mirror, circular, about 4 inches in diameter, with a handle stub that had broken off at some point, polished to a reflective finish on one face and engraved on the other with a scene in low relief. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, presents an immediate problem in a pre-Columbian North American context, because while copper was worked extensively, the deliberate creation of bronze, requiring the combination of copper with tin, is not part of the documented technological tradition of the Mississippi Valley cultures. It is, however, part of the documented tradition of Mesoamerica, where a tin-bronze tradition developed in western Mexico and spread northward through trade routes into the American Southwest by around 900 CE. The engraved scene on the mirror's back showed a large boat, with a high prow and multiple figures aboard, on a stylized representation of open water. The boat's design does not match any known Mesoamerican watercraft. The team has been unable to identify a cultural tradition it belongs to. Dr. Weller described the object in her field notes as, and I'm quoting directly, "the thing that made me start asking questions I wasn't sure I was allowed to ask." Number 4 was a collection of seeds. That sounds, again, like the kind of thing you could explain away until you find out which seeds. The collection comprised 47 seeds of 11 different species, carefully sorted by type into small packets made from folded leaves that had been sealed with a plant resin. The whole collection then wrapped in tanned hide and placed in a ceramic jar. The botanist's species identification took 2 months. 3 of the 11 species were native to the Mississippi Valley and unremarkable. 4 were native to the American Southwest, consistent with the documented trade networks of the region. 2 were Gulf Coast species, also not impossible to explain. But the final 2 species were neither North nor Central American in origin. They were Andean. One was a variety of quinoa, the grain crop that was a staple of civilizations in what is now Bolivia and Peru. The other was a species of capsicum, a hot pepper, from a lineage that the botanist's genetic analysis traced to cultivation centers in the Andes rather than in Mesoamerica, where peppers were also grown, but in different varieties. Andean crop seeds, carefully sorted and preserved, on an island in the Mississippi River in the 12th century. The trade network that deposited these seeds on this island, if it was a single connected network, stretched from the Andes to the Great Lakes. Number 3 was a map, and it was the clearest, most confident piece of geographic evidence the team found. It was incised on a flat piece of slate, about 12 inches by 8, and it showed a detailed river system. The geographers on the team spent a week with it before arriving at their identification, and they arrived at it with high confidence. The river system depicted on the slate is the Mississippi and its major tributaries, the Missouri, the Ohio, the Arkansas, the Red, all identifiable from their relative positions and orientations, rendered with a geographic accuracy that implies either first-hand knowledge of an enormous territory or access to compiled geographic information from multiple sources. The island itself appears to be marked on the map, a small dot in the river channel at a location corresponding to Site 17G. And downstream from the island, in the section of the map corresponding to the lower Mississippi, there is a second cluster of markings, a series of small symbols arranged along the river's edge that the team's epigrapher tentatively identified as the same writing system as the clay tablet. Someone had written on this map, in an unknown language, in the section corresponding to the mouth of the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico. Whatever they wrote, it was clearly important enough to inscribe on a map of a continent. Number 2 was found at the deepest excavated layer of the island, which means it was the oldest thing there, predating most of the other objects by what the radiocarbon dates suggest may be 2 or 3 centuries. It was a wooden post, or rather the base of one. The remaining 18 inches of what had once been a much taller upright structure, preserved in the waterlogged sediment at the very center of the island. The post was made from a single piece of bald cypress, a tree native to the river bottoms of the lower Mississippi Valley, and it had been carved and painted before being set into the island's substrate. The carvings were abstract, a series of nested concentric circles interrupted by radial lines, a design that appears in rock art sites across the continent from Ontario to New Mexico and is widely interpreted as a solar symbol. But it was the condition of the post's base that interested the archaeologists most. The end that had been planted in the ground had been treated with a fire-hardening technique, charred deliberately to resist rot, and the earth immediately around it had been packed with small pieces of copper, hundreds of them. Small irregular fragments pressed into the soil as if the post had been planted in a bed of metal. The post predates the other objects by 2 to 3 centuries. Something was happening on this island long before the objects that surround it were deposited. The post was the anchor. Everything else was assembled around it. And now we come to number 1. This is the object that caused Dr. Weller to write in her private journal, a journal that was shared with me by a member of her research team, words I want to read exactly as she wrote them. She wrote, "I have spent 23 years learning how to be certain before I speak. I am not certain about this. I am going to tell you what I see and let you do with it what you will." What she saw was a carved wooden panel, about 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, found face down in the sediment at a depth that placed it stratigraphically among the oldest objects on the island. The panel had been protected by having been pressed against a hard clay substrate face down, which kept the carved and painted surface in a microenvironment with almost no oxygen for the better part of a millennium. When it was turned face up in the laboratory, the preservation was extraordinary. The full surface was legible. The panel depicted a scene, a narrative scene, of the kind that tells a story in a single image. In the lower portion, a large body of water with stylized waves. In the upper right, a circular object that every person in the room immediately interpreted as a sun or a celestial body of some kind. In the center, a vessel, a large watercraft of a form that no one on the team had seen in any pre-Columbian North American context, with a high curved prow, a stepped structure amidships, and multiple vertical elements that the nautical historian brought in to consult identified, with clear discomfort, as masts. Not poles, not ceremonial uprights. Masts, with what appear to be the remnants of rigging lines incised into the wood between them. Standing on the vessel were 5 human figures, rendered with a specificity of costume detail that suggested the carver was working from observation or from a very detailed description passed down through careful oral tradition. The figures wore layered garments with structured shoulders. One of them held an object above their head that the art historian said looked, and she used the word with full knowledge of what it implied, like a cross. Not a Native American cross and circle symbol, a plain, Latin-form cross, held vertically in an outstretched hand. Dr. Weller presented this object to the full research team and asked for interpretations. The range of responses she received fell into 3 categories. First, that the cross was coincidental, that the carver had depicted a standard tool or ceremonial object that happens to resemble a cross. Second, that the panel was a post-contact piece that had somehow ended up in a pre-contact stratigraphic layer. Third, that the panel was exactly what the stratigraphy said it was, pre-Columbian, and depicted something the carver had seen or heard described, an ocean-going vessel from somewhere else, crewed by people who looked different, carrying an object that was sacred to them. The second interpretation requires the stratigraphy to be wrong. 3 independent assessments have said it is not wrong. The first interpretation requires the cross to be incidental, which the art historian considers implausible given the specificity and intentionality of everything else on the panel. The third interpretation requires a conclusion that the academic community is not, as a whole, ready to draw. Dr. Weller submitted her findings with the third interpretation stated as the most parsimonious explanation of the evidence. 2 members of the team refused to co-sign that conclusion and resigned. The report was revised before publication to describe the cross as a possible ceremonial symbol of uncertain affiliation. But the panel exists, the stratigraphy exists, and the 5 figures on their masted vessel are still there in the image, looking out over a stylized ocean, 800 years before anyone was supposed to be crossing it. Here is what I want to leave you with. Across these 20 objects, the team documented material originating from or connected to cultures in Minnesota, Michigan, Texas, Florida, the American Southwest, the Gulf Coast of Mexico, Central America, and the Andes. The island was not a village site. There are no post holes for domestic structures, no food processing debris, no evidence of permanent habitation. It appears to have been a place of intentional deposition, somewhere people came, from very different places, to leave things of significance. Whether it was a trading hub, a sacred site, a meeting place, or something for which we don't yet have a category, is a question the objects themselves cannot fully answer. But they answer enough. They answer enough to tell us that the world before Columbus was not a scattering of isolated peoples stumbling through a continent that had never been fully known. It was a connected world, a world of long journeys and careful preservation and objects carried across thousands of miles, because they mattered, because knowledge mattered, because contact mattered. The island is still there. The objects are in storage. The clay tablet has not been deciphered. And somewhere in the sediment of the Mississippi River, there are almost certainly more islands we haven't found yet. Drop a comment right now and tell me which of these 20 objects changes the way you think about American history the most. I read everyone, and I will see you in the next video.